Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. I'm Julia Joja, a Senior Fellow at MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event on human rights violations in Black Sea occupied territories. MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative explores the Black Sea as a region for transatlantic security and development. And with today's event that is part of our effort for Black Sea security and dialogue, we look at human rights violations in illegally annexed Crimea and the occupied territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Human rights violations have become really a constant element of Russian aggression in the Black Sea region. In both cases, Georgia and Ukraine, unlawful killings and detentions, enforced disappearances, abductions, and torture are some of the most flagrant human rights violations that Russian and de facto authorities are committing against the populations in these territories. Additionally, Russian and de facto authorities in the occupied territories have also developed targeted policies against the local populations, such as borderization in Georgia and militarization and passportization in both Ukraine and Georgia. And these are the things that, some of the things that we'll go into in our discussion. And then in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, rights in the occupied territories have worsened as a situation overall, and authorities have further restricted freedom of movement, access to education and healthcare, freedom of religion, and workers' ability to secure livelihood. Our aim today is to discuss some of these issues and how they affect the region in the different cases, and what the international community can do more to improve the situation on the ground. And also, we'd like to highlight these, raise awareness, and create more visibility for the problems of our region. And I'd like to take the opportunity of hosting our two esteemed panelists today who have studied and worked on these issues extensively to offer a broad picture of the various human rights violations in Georgia and Ukraine, and compare them to be able to distill some of the commonalities that we're dealing with in the region in terms of Russian aggression. I am joined today and thrilled to be joined today by Maria Tomak, who's the coordinator for Media Initiative for Human Rights in Ukraine, and by Anne Turtsumia Zurabishvili, who is a project manager at the East-West Management Institute and in Georgia. For their full bios of our distinguished speakers, please visit our MEI website. And also, I look forward to taking audience questions through our Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. And for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI Frontier. And if you have any technical issues, again, please email events@mei.edu. And please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for all of your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll factor in as many as possible into our discussion to be able to have a comprehensive and wide-ranging discussion. And so with that, let me start with an overview that I'd like our panelists to provide in terms of what are the most important and flagrant human rights violations over time from the moment of occupation and how they evolved to this point. And then I'll dig into or drill into some of the more current issues right now and how the situation has been evolving during the COVID pandemic. Maria, if I may start with you, could you provide us with an overview of human rights violations specifically in Crimea and in the work that you've been doing addressing some of these?
Hello, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this event. And I would also like to thank to the audience that joined us now when all around the place you have this Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin's negotiations, but I believe that those negotiations can also affect those things that we're going to discuss tonight. I represent the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and this organization was established in 2016, and we're dealing with the human rights consequences of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, in both occupied Crimea and in Donbass as well, which is a bit different issue, and maybe we can touch upon this issue today as well. And I think that this conversation is very timely for a few reasons. First of all, because of the initiative that was proclaimed by the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian president at the highest level, which is called Crimean Platform. And I'm glad that the US as a state has already declared that they're going to join this initiative, and more precisely this summit that is going to take place in August in Kyiv. And just to give you this broad understanding, it's the initiative that is aimed at combining the efforts of the international community at both governmental and non-governmental level in order to deoccupy Crimea and to deal with the consequences of the occupation and attempted annexation of Crimea. And the second reason, I think that it's very important that you have invited various regions, various countries, but we still have to deal in both cases with Georgia and Ukraine with the Russian aggression, which is kind of tries to pretend that it's not an aggression, but the people's will. And it's very interesting to discuss all this hybrid warfare and all these influences and misinformation and disinformation, which is used by Russia and which is instrumentalized now not only against post-Soviet countries that Russia tries to keep very near, very close, but also against EU countries and US as well. It's obvious, of course, that human rights have been deteriorating in the Crimean Peninsula since 2014, and it is reflected in the numerous resolutions of the UNGA. If one is interested precisely in some particular rights, you can check all those resolutions, and it's obvious that the situation is much more worse. I will highlight some of the particular violations, but I would like to bring here my own experience, because in 2014, in March, when the occupation started, I was in Crimea. And for me, as well as for probably all the other citizens of Ukraine, it was totally shocking, because Ukraine has never faced such a large scale crackdown on civil population. I mean, the kidnappings, the torturing, and missing persons, and so on. So it was totally new chapter in Ukrainians' history. And for me, it was obvious that it's not something that is actually an aggression. All these little green men and so on, it was very obvious. But I'm just trying to underline that that was something new in terms of the level and the scale of human rights violations for Ukraine. And this level, this high level, is still there, obviously. Speaking about the key human rights violations now, I would start probably with the problem of prisoners. Currently, we have more than 100 people detained in Crimea, but also transferred from Crimea to the Russian Federation. And these people are detained in the context of politically motivated cases. Mostly these cases are related to the so-called extremism or terrorism. So Russia abuses its anti-extremism and anti-terrorism legislation in order to persecute activists or just people who who try to make some resistance to the occupation. And unfortunately, the main target, the key target for these violations are Crimean Tatars. This is the kind of the ethnic group, and I would like to underline a very important thing, that this is not the minority. This is the indigenous population of Crimea. It means that there's no other place in the world where these people can actually live they have no state. So, and they have also this very dramatic history of being deported by Stalin back in 1940s, and they put lots of efforts in order to return to Crimea from the Central Asia, and now they're kind of subjected to something that they call hybrid deportation. So just occupying power, the Russian Federation tries to squeeze them out, to expel them from Crimea, since Crimean Tatars are not loyal towards the occupation authorities. And among those detained, we have at least 11 journalists or bloggers or people who serve as, so to say, civil journalists. I think that's a very interesting phenomenon that we can witness in Crimea, because all of the professional journalists, independent professional journalists, were squeezed out from the very beginning of the occupation in 2014. But later, this developed this phenomenon of civil journalism. And this is something that reminds me of Myanmar, for instance, when you also have this civil journalism development, and those people are also targeted by the authorities. So here we have something very similar. And civil journalists are acting within the initiative, which is called Crimean Solidarity Group. And I think that's a very important phenomenon, because this is the totally peaceful initiative that tries to make a resistance via documenting human rights violations, via reporting them publicly, via delivering some speeches and some statements within the public events, and so on and so forth, and via providing the humanitarian assistance to the families of those who are detained, because mostly these are the families that have lots of children, and currently more than 200 children in Crimea, they left without the parental care because their fathers are detained within this politically motivated cases. Another important trend that affects the human rights is the militarization. And recently we had few, again, resolutions of the UNGA specifically focusing at militarization of Crimea as a separate problem. And this problem touches upon not only military or security issues, but human rights as well. I mean, the militarization of the public space, engaging children in different military activities, which looks awful, but which also may amount to war crime. And also the forceful conscription of Ukrainian citizens in Crimea to the Russian army. And of course, here we can link this violation to the fact that Russia, of course, does not recognize Crimea as an occupied area, does not apply the international humanitarian law to Crimea as it should actually, and in a violation of the international humanitarian law, Russia extends its own legislation to this area, pretending that Crimea is just another federal, another part of the Russian Federation, which is not, and which is not recognized, as we all know, by the international community. And I just wanted to highlight also this very important thing, because previously, the fact that Crimea is an occupied area was recognized at the political level by the UN and by the UNGA and by vast majority of the countries. But previous year, it was also de facto recognized by European Court for Human Rights. This institution is not relevant for the US, obviously, but it's very much relevant for the European context. And maybe my Georgian colleague can also share some experience with the possible recognition of the occupation of Georgian territories. But for Ukraine is a very important fact, and we are waiting for the further steps of the European Court for Human Rights when it comes to Donbass as well. But the situation there is much more complicated. So in Crimea, we have obviously the persecution of the religious groups. I have mentioned Crimean Tatars, mostly these are Muslims, and they are persecuted for in a violation of the freedom of belief, I would say, but also Ukrainian church is persecuted basically either because Ukrainian church has always been kind of a spot for this pro-Ukrainian people and pro-Ukrainian activism, but also and that is the reflection of the trend in Russia itself, is the persecution, criminal persecution of the Jehovah Witnesses. And we have a number of cases, and people are detained for being part of Jehovah Witnesses movement. What is interesting when it comes to Crimean Tatars, I would also like to mention that the representative body of Crimean Tatars, Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, has been banned since the very beginning. And despite all the calls from the international community, but also from the International Court of Justice, who ruled that Russia should remove this ban, Majlis is still banned. And what is interesting when it comes not only to Crimea, but when you look at this broader Russian context, is that just the same practices are now applied to Navalny Foundation in Russia itself. So when Majlis was banned in Crimea, it was not so much noticed, I'm sorry to say that, by the Russian liberal and Russian society. But now which is kind of falls under this logics of the repressive authoritarian regimes, but now it's the turn of these Russian movements that are kind of Moscow based. And of course, you have mentioned the COVID, and obviously the pandemic brought a bunch of problems, more problems to Crimea. But I think that the most significant one is that despite, again, all the resolutions and all the calls from the international community, there's no access to Crimea of any independent international monitoring mechanisms. And that's the one of the key problems, because we cannot be sure that the statistics which is published by the Russian government is true. And moreover, our colleagues, human rights defenders and organizations that have some people working in the field in Crimea under the cover, obviously, they report that that there was a pressure on the medical staff in order to provide the false statistics of those people who were infected or died from the COVID-19. And maybe just to finish, I would like to say that if you look at key human rights violations in Crimea, and if you try to analyze, you can see that all of them are aimed at one big goal, is decolonization. It's the term which is used also in the international humanitarian law, and which means that Russia tries to squeeze out, to expel the non-loyal population, the Ukrainian, the Crimean Tatar population from Crimea, but also they bring to Crimea some of the Russian military, extra-military stuff, some of the law enforcement stuff, some of the Secret Service, Russian FSB stuff, some of the civil servants, like judges, for instance. So that's how this colonization happens. So that changes the demographic composition of Crimea, and that puts brings lots of the additional challenges to some further moves of Ukraine and international community in terms of the further deoccupation of Crimea, because if that happens, we will have the different Crimea there. So, and if you try to, again, to raise this issue of the proper referendum, for instance, the situation there will be just different. And that, of course, brings additional challenges for Ukraine about how we should deal with that people that were brought to Crimea. So that's a huge problem, and that's a problem, I believe, for Georgia as well. And just to wrap up, regarding what can be done, I just would like to invite all the experts, organizations, and all of those people who consider themselves as those who are interested in Ukrainian developments to join somehow the Crimean Platform Initiative. Now we are in the process of establishing the expert network of the Crimean Platform, and probably I can give more details separately, not to overwhelm our conversation today. But I would like to say that I believe that the occupation of Crimea and of Donbass as well is impossible without the international community, because of course the capacity of Ukraine and of Russia now, even though Russia is not the most powerful state, repressive state now, but still it's incomparable. So therefore we are really we really think and we expect to get this support from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for this fantastic overview. You touched on most of the topics that I wanted to ask you, and I have a bunch of questions for you. But let me turn first. Thank you for highlighting the Crimea platform. It's a fantastic initiative to be able to raise awareness in the region for some of these issues, and also the role of civil society in the absence of the international community, and what difference civil society, people like both of you, can make to the human rights situation in occupied territories. Let me turn to Anne. If you would provide us with an overview of the issues that the Georgian government faces under the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's now been, I believe, 13 years, and unfortunately, with all the crises in the international community, issues like that get forgotten. So this is our opportunity to make a small contribution to highlight some of the ongoing human rights violations and the biggest challenges that the Georgian civil society and overall Georgia is facing in the context of ongoing occupation. So if you could give us an overview of the commonalities of the human rights violations in both the regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that would be great.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for hosting me today. Although the topic is really worrying and difficult, I'm still happy to talk about the human rights violations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because I will be talking about the people who are the most unheard and most unspoken, probably. Also, probably we haven't learned enough from the other experiences that exist, and Crimea is a relatively new case compared to Georgia, because Russia, before becoming an aggressor, it had a name of peacekeeper when it comes to the conflicts in Georgia, because conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they erupted the beginning of 90s, and actually I was also among, me and my family were among 250,000 Georgians in early 90s who were expelled from Abkhazia just because of the Russian aggression. So since the 2008 war, of course, we are talking about the occupied territories of Georgia, because Georgia unfortunately didn't have any opportunity to prove that the Russian military standing on those territories, they were not peacekeepers, but Russia was the occupying power since the very beginning. Since 2008, situation has even worsened in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. After early 90s, after 94, when the armed conflicts in South Ossetia and Abkhazia ended, some Georgians decided to return back to their homes, although this wasn't a process facilitated by international actors or somehow managed or a peaceful process. But around approximately 40,000 Georgians decided to return to their homes starting from 94 in Gali district, which is a mostly ethnic Georgian populated district in Abkhazia. So since then, these people have been under oppression. I mean, before they have been living in limbo. In academic literature, we would see that those de facto states live in limbo. But right now, I would say that this is something like living in a permanent prison or permanent custody. And I will explain, of course, why. Just small remark that just recently Abkhazia held its local elections, local government elections, and imagine that only 80 ethnic Georgians, 80, had the right to participate in those elections. And this is just a small illustration of how people are deprived of their political, social, and economic rights on the occupied territories. Right now, compared to pre-2008 where the situation is worse, because before 2008 there were two missions, one mission covering Abkhazia, UN monitoring mission, and another OSCE mission covering South Ossetia Tskhinvali region. But post 2008 war, there is no international security and monitoring mechanism that monitors the situation on the ground or protects the rights of ordinary people on the ground. Also, the Russian aggression is demonstrated in a way that all the dirty job is done by the de facto authorities, let's say. And this is the path that Russia has chosen. When it comes to specific human rights violations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia is completely closed for even researchers or for academic personnel for visits. We don't know what is happening there, but time to time, of course, we learn about the cases of abduction and unlawful killings, like that Unashvili case a couple of years ago, when citizens of Georgia are detained unlawfully by Russian military and taken to Tskhinvali, which is the center of South Ossetia, and then sentenced or tortured for just violating so-called border. And if someone is not familiar with this kind of borders, probably better to explain that so-called border between Georgia and the former autonomy of South Ossetia, it's a nominal border or an imaginary border, because you are just walking in the field, and it happens that you are on the side that is not controlled by the Georgian authorities. And that's why the Russian military started the borderization process very actively when the territory is divided by the barbed wires. And I would like to say something about the story of a man who lived in Akhalgori, let's say in one of the villages close to the Georgian controlled territory. And one day he woke up and half of his ear was cut by the barbed wires. And he decided not to leave his home. And home is a very, important part of the identity of Georgians and any person who has been displaced forcefully, and Data Vanishvili, he never left his home, and he was looking after the graves of his neighbors who could never visit the graves of their relatives, and he actually passed away just recently. And nobody from the Georgian proper could say goodbye to him, because people were standing just behind the barbed wires, and his wife with his coffin was standing on the other side of the barbed wire. So this borderization has a really tragic consequences for many people. And when it comes to Abkhazia, all started off with the aim to kind of perish off the Georgian trace from Abkhazia, because about 7-8 years ago, the Abkhaz de facto authorities decided that Georgians didn't have the right to receive education in their mother tongue. And that resulted in a process of, children, and as I said, there are approximately, it's not registered, but approximately 40,000 Georgians ethnic Georgians living in Abkhazia, and suddenly they had to completely move to instructing in the Russian language, which is of course not the native language for Abkhaz either, but this is of course a form of the Russian aggression and form of human rights violation in Abkhazia, that you are not allowed to talk in your mother tongue and receive education. And after that, the Abkhaz authorities also denied the access for ethnic Georgians who graduated from high schools in Abkhazia to pass the entry exams on the Georgian side. And in that case, many students and youth were deprived their right to education. Also, the issue with passportization is very alarming in Abkhazia, because the rules are changing constantly. And right now there is a rule that even though, to bring you an example, my grandmother is 89 years old, and she was born in Sukhumi. She has never lived outside that territory, but she has a status of temporary resident of Abkhazia, just because she's ethnic Georgian and loyal to the Georgian government, and also doesn't want to leave her Georgian identity, and she's a citizen of Georgia. That's quite how to say, comical, but at the same time, it is depriving rights of for many people who are living in Abkhazia and who are ethnic Georgians. So it's like saying no to your identity just to continue living there. And when it comes to COVID-19, the situation has only worsened since then, because just couple of months ago, 4 people drowned when they were trying to cross the Anguri River that is separating Abkhazia from Georgia proper, just to cross the river and get their social benefits and their retirement pension, just those 4 people perished in that river. And many other cases similar to that happened because they don't have so-called proper documents to cross the only existing crossing point. This is not similar to any conflict that I have actually studied, and I have been to a couple of so-called borders of conflicts, but nothing similar have I encountered, because people are just denied the access despite the reason they have. And since the beginning of the pandemic, the Nguri Bridge, which is the only entry point, the crossing point for people to move between Abkhazia and Georgia proper, has been closed and hasn't been opened. And it has been opened for a couple of times, just for people to get their retirement pensions, or in a very critical cases to receive medical assistance, because one can imagine probably that healthcare system in Abkhazia or South Ossetia isn't developed enough to treat the COVID, really heavy COVID patients. And on top of that, actually, I need to say this, that the Georgian government introduced a quarantine for people who were traveling from Abkhazia to Georgia proper. So every person who would cross the Nguri Bridge, the crossing point, they had to pass through the 5-day mandatory quarantine in a hotel. And those 5 days were really too much for people. And to avoid those rules, people just continue to cross the territory by different means, and those means are swimming the river, and also getting through the mud and through the forests. And the most importantly, one needs to hide from the Russian soldiers, otherwise they will be arrested and taken to the isolator. This is just in short. I don't want to take much time and prefer to take questions, but as I see the cases and the approach of the occupying power is quite similar. It's sometimes it's really hard to imagine that somebody is sentenced to 12 years in prison in Trin Valley in South Ossetia just for so-called illegal border crossing. Like we have a case of Gacheladze, who hasn't seen his family for more than a year, and his family is worried that he won't make it alive through these 12 years of unlawful imprisoning. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, so much for this overview, for explaining us the differences in problems between Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and for providing these very powerful examples of how terrible these effects of human rights violations are on individuals. I do see, you pointed out at the end, a lot of similarities between what is happening, what Maria described in Crimea and what you described in the occupied Georgian territories. And just as a side note, as people from the region with historical and personal experience there, the similarities between the two, I think, expand throughout the region and remind us a lot of the aggression of the Soviet Union against different minorities, different people, human rights violations, which also reflects to us that the commonalities are over time, and we're still fighting the same problems in the region, to be able to be independent and sovereign, and human rights to be respected. Let me, as we have only 20 minutes left of this panel, let me start weighing in some of the questions we're getting from the audience. And to the audience, please again feel free to send us your questions, and we'll factor in as many as possible. Let me briefly turn to Anne and then to Maria with the following question. I think Maria mentioned that throughout her overview, the European Court of Human Rights has had some impact in Georgia, in Ukraine, but this leads us to the question in terms of two aspects. On one side, the international community, the effect that it has in terms of monitoring and the limits of that, and then also civil society and the difference it has made and can make on the way ahead. So Anne, first to you, and then maybe over to Maria. Can you tell us from your perspective, having lived and studied these things, how do you assess the international community's work so far in the region, and the civil society, local Georgian civil society as well? And how do you see the way ahead in terms of what more should be done urgently and in the long term to improve the situation on the ground?
Thank you. This is the most worrying part of the problem, probably, because as I mentioned, there is no existing international security or monitoring mechanism for Abkhazia and South Ossetia right now. The only existing format is the Geneva International Discussions, where Russia, Georgia, the United States, European Union, and other actors participate, and the de facto authorities from South Ossetia and Abkhazia observe the negotiations. However, Russia has managed to kind of making this format pretty much dysfunctional, and nothing tangible has changed since the beginning of the Geneva International discussions. Even the small formats like incident prevention and reaction mechanism, when Georgian and de facto authorities would meet in Abkhazia and South Ossetia to discuss human rights violations and burning topics. It finally ended up being, walkout sessions from the Russian authorities and from de facto authorities, because when it comes to difficult cases, nobody really wants to discuss those and to find the solution. So, bringing a real meaning to Geneva International discussions and making it a really high-profile discussions is a very important step that needs to be taken. Also, the Georgian authorities have been really busy with the preventing the international recognition of its occupied territories that Russia has been trying to gain for Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But meanwhile, those human rights violations have only increased and nothing has been done. At least people who live on those territories, they feel abandoned by the Georgian authorities, first of all, and they feel that neither the de facto authorities nor the Georgian authorities perceive them as their own people. So this is something really tragic, I think, and that situation has to change. And first of all, I think the Georgian government has its share in that process, developing specific policies towards people who are the defenders of the Georgian identity on the ground. And also we have a European Union monitoring mission that operates in Georgia and observes the situation from Georgia, but allowing this monitoring mission on the ground is really important. And also it is very important, I have to underline this, the support that Georgia gets from the international partners and its strategic partners, because it's much appreciated in Georgia that on annual basis, the US appropriations bill, it contains a note about Georgia's occupied territories, that US will not deliver any assistance to a country that doesn't recognize territorial integrity of Georgia. And this kind of support is really pivotal for countries, small countries like Georgia, who are against the Russian aggression, which has taken many forms and many means in recent years.
Thank you, Anne. And over to you, Maria. If you can, so kind of a double or triple-fold question from me. If you can tell us your overview or your assessment of the international community's work with Crimea specifically, civil society that has been such a linchpin in helping on diminishing human rights violations in Crimea, given limited or no access of the international community. And then kind of the second part of that is if you can also tell us a little bit about how the situation in Crimea compares to the situation in the Donbass. How are they different, especially in the context of human rights violations?
Thank you. I would need another hour to answer all those questions, but I will try to do that briefly. First of all, I would like to echo this idea or this this fact about the international negotiations platform. So we have Minsk negotiation platform, we had at least, for Donbass, but we had no place to discuss Crimea. And of course, Russia would refuse any attempts to suggest such platform. And actually, Crimean platform, again, going back to this issue, is an attempt to create this place for negotiation. And Russia would be able to join this platform as soon as it's ready to talk about the fate of Crimea. And I should say that if you follow the Russian reaction towards the Crimean platform and the fact that lots of countries do proclaim that they support this idea, they feel, I mean, Russia feels really nervous. And they even create some task forces within the Russian MFA in order to discuss how to make sabotage of whole this idea. So I think that this support of these sort of things is very important. And I think that here the role of Ukraine is crucial, because if Ukraine is not active in suggesting such things, in being proactive, we cannot wait that international community will do all our job for us. So I think that's here where the role of the government, but also of civil society, is really crucial, the civil society of Ukraine. And when we discuss what can be done, I think that the instrument of sanctions is really important. So we have witnessed lots of debates over these years, like whether sanctions are effective, efficient or not. I believe they are effective, and I think that that is proved by various data provided by various analytical projects and institutions. But also, even when it comes to this human rights dimension specifically that I deal with, I believe that Magnitsky legislation and sanctions against those who violate human rights in Crimea and in Donbass is really important, even in terms of its symbolism, right? So this is unacceptable for us to torture people. So that's what these sanctions may show. And I think that the US is really a champion here in imposing those sanctions in relation to events in Crimea, in Donbass. But I think that EU is a bit behind. So I think that EU could be more active in terms of imposing sanctions. And of course, that is, I mean, now it's debated whether it's possible to apply some very heavy sanctions weapons, I would say. I mean, to switch off SWIFT, for instance, whether it is suitable or not. But anyways, I think that the instrument of sanctions is really crucial now. Also, as for this difference between Crimea and Donbass, it's a very important and interesting question. But just essentially, the key difference is that Russia recognizes its control over Crimea, but it doesn't recognize its control over Donbass. And that has, in terms of the work that we do, it has its drawbacks, but also some good things in terms of how we operate, because at least in Crimea, we do understand who violates the rights of these people. In Donbass, it's much more complicated. We have currently at least 120 people detained in Donbass in various places, but they are under the control of different groups, illegal armed groups, and it's really hard to understand where are they, I mean, whom we can refer to in order to figure out whether those people are still alive and so on. These people are totally deprived of any legal aid, unlike those who are held in Crimea. So I would say that the situation is different. And of course, in terms of recognition, Ukrainian law says that Crimea is temporarily occupied by Russia and Donbass is temporarily occupied by Russia. But when it comes to international community, of course, the wording when it comes to Donbass is much more, I would say, the international community avoids these definitions regarding the occupation, of course. And I believe this situation will ongoing until some institutions like International Criminal Court, or at least the European Court for Human Rights, will recognize that this occupation is, this territory is occupied by Russia. But I think that's a separate issue, which is quite complicated. But at least we have this negotiation process over Donbass in Minsk, the so-called Minsk process, but no place at all to discuss Crimea, even in terms of some crucial humanitarian issues. And just last thing about the civil society, I think that, again, comparing Donbass and Crimea, the role of civil society in Crimea is just tremendous. And really, I would say that those mostly Crimean Tatars that launched this Crimean initiative, the initiative called Crimean Solidarity, is a phenomenon, because this is the main source of the information about developments in Crimea, all the searches, the court hearings, the new detentions and so on, tortures and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, we don't have any such groups in Donbass, which also underlines the level of insecurity. So in Donbass, even if you publish some information anonymously in the social media, you are, most likely that you will end up in the basement, so-called basement, because not always they use even the official places of detention. So people can be held anywhere. So, and unfortunately, it's just impossible to have any sort of like this resistance, very peaceful resistance, just at the level of documenting the human rights violations in Donbass. In Crimea, it's still possible. And last but not least, I would like to say that it's really important that the international community not underestimate the Russian threat. Because I feel like now the threat number one, China is considered a threat number one, and I mean, and I totally agree with that, because the economical, so to say, capacity is huge, even comparing to Russia. But still, I think that those recent Russian activities, like meddling in the elections, like this series of political assassinations and political executions all over the place, not only in Russia, that shows that all this KGB heritage lives and it's instrumentalized against the free world. And we have to oppose that somehow.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing out towards the end something that I'd like to close with, kind of a last question in the last few minutes that I have, and that is disinformation as a tool of Russian aggression that is affecting the whole region, and I would argue has been affecting, as Maria pointed out, the international community, and particularly the transatlantic security community. Now, Ukraine and Georgia both have been bearing the brunt of this disinformation, and it's been deepened and kind of perfectionized, if you can say that, in the occupied territories. Both of you have touched on some of these issues, language, imprisonment for free speech, but also Russia's overall aggressive actions towards pushing out information, including on the occupied territories within the international community and targeted on the citizens on the ground, to be able to fight anything that is of democratic value, of freedom, of human rights, and to push its own agenda and its own kind of disinformation. And in particular, over the last year, as we've seen with the pandemic, we have had even more of a crackdown on free speech, and a more aggressive narrative, by the way, from China too, but particularly from Russia in this current context. So if you can sum up in just 1 minute, each of you, how do you think this disinformation as a major tool of Russian aggression is affecting occupied territories, in your cases, both Georgia and Ukraine, and overall when it comes to the understanding of these problems in the international community? And if I can give you the word first, and then we'll turn over to Maria.
Thank you. I think that Russia has even taken advantages on COVID-19 pandemic, because the only vaccine that is offered to the residents of occupied territories, and by that I mean both Abkhaz, Georgian, Ossetian and Russian communities living on occupied territories. The only vaccine that was promised and offered by Russia is Sputnik. And of course, with that comes the whole wave of disinformation about the origins of pandemic, and how the Western world decided to attack such communities, and the Russian vaccine is the only savior. And also during the pandemic, those communities find hard to believe that the pandemic is actually going on, because they don't really have access to any other source of information rather than Russian. They are under huge influence of that anti-Western disinformation, and of course that all the language and passportization politics is part of that, because Georgians are prevented to take tests for entry exams in Georgian universities, but they are offered free places and scholarships in Russian universities. So this is what I was saying, that disinformation and the hybrid war from Russia has taken many forms, and this is just one of them.
Thank you, Anne. Over to you, Maria.
Yes, actually, I think that this misinformation, disinformation is an essential part of the Russian aggression. I would say maybe it's a cornerstone. And without that, it won't be as much effective. But I can say that there's a significant process in, so to say, understanding this misinformation and disinformation from the side of the international community. I recall that back in 2014, when we've been traveling with my colleagues to Brussels, for instance, screaming that the Russian Federation attacks Ukraine, intervened Ukraine. Excuse me, but nobody believed us. Like people were saying, excuse me, you have civil war in Ukraine. What's the role of Russia? But now I think that there's much more understanding of how all this misinformation and disinformation works. And here, of course, all the efforts in order to support the independent journalism, even if it's like a civil journalism, non-professional journalism in the field, like I was mentioned in Crimea, is crucial. And just the last thing, I think I'm obliged to mention this case of Vladislav Yesepenko, a Ukrainian journalist who used to work in Crimea. So he was not publicly working, but somehow Russian special forces managed to identify him. He was in prison, he was heavily tortured. But I believe that this case is especially important for the US context, since he was working for the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the head office and the management of the RFERL is supporting very actively Vladislav, but I mean, it's always up to various civil society and expert networks as well to express this solidarity and support with those people who are not just detained, but really cruelly tortured, which sounds and looks just awful.
Thank you. So thank you, Maria, and thank you, Anne, so much for joining our discussion, for weighing in with your opinions and your life experience in the end in these occupied territories and on human rights violations. Such an important topic, and we're honored and thrilled to have hosted you today for this discussion. I would have loved to go on for at least another hour to discuss some of the details, but we hope that it was an interesting conversation for our participants as well. Thank you to all our attendees. And we hope we'll be able to support your work and continue to work together in the future to raise awareness on these issues and fight human rights violations in occupied territories along the Black Sea region. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you for participating and for weighing in. Thank you for MEI for organizing this, and I wish you all a good rest of the day and